and he asked me to get up, go to the window with him, and he pointed to the Supreme Court building, and he said, Mike, let me ask you a question. Do you think there's any corruption in that building? I laughed. I said, are you kidding? I said, absolutely. He says, good, because that's what you're going to do when I make you chief of the Rackets division. You want it? I said, absolutely. It was like, you know, I had hit a grand slam at that point. It was great. It was terrific. And it was right around, it was April of 2001 that I started. And things were good, you know, the first year. I got used to things, and, you know, we had the horrible, obviously the horrific events of 9/11, and I will never forget those days, because as I said, my office overlooked the Trade Center, and I didn't see the first plane, but I did see the second, and I did see the collapse. So it was unbelievable. Again, one of those things you don't forget. And you know, we had on Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn is a very big, you know, Muslim population, Arab population, and of course the knee-jerk reaction is, oh, we got to go out there and find out who did this kind of thing, and you know, that's not the way that good law enforcement works. You do it based on investigation and things of that nature. But we got through it. We got through it, and by the time the case I'm about to tell you, which begins about 6 or 7 years of a continuing corruption investigation that I did, along with my colleagues in the Rackets division, the cops, the detectives of the NYPD, the detectives of the KCDA, Kings County DA's office. We wound up okay. We wound up doing an investigation, a series of investigations that, when I finally retired in 2013, I look back on it and say, wow, that was some period. And my friend, Jerry Schmetterer, who was the spokesperson for the DA, who was a former reporter, and I became very, very good friends, because as chief of Rackets, I was the guy providing most of the publicity cases for the DA's office. And we're at lunch one day, and he said to me, sort of in the middle of this whole thing, he says, Mike, you know, when we leave here, if Hines doesn't win, we need to do a book. And that became Crooked Brooklyn. And we started writing the book in early 2014, and by the time, it was early 2015 when we finally published it. But what started this whole thing, this huge corruption investigation, was what we call in the book the sleeping judge. And I'll tell you the story very quickly. A lawyer who was representing a mother and her young baby, almost a baby, a little older than a baby, were in a horrific car accident in Brooklyn. And they sued whoever it was that they sued. The case was put in front of a judge by the name of Victor Barron, Supreme Court judge in Brooklyn. And ultimately the case was settled. The insurance company settled it, millions of dollars, multi-million dollars. And in New York, in order for a case to be settled where you have what we call an infant, a young person as a victim, you have to get the judge's approval on the settlement. Why? Because the law doesn't want a mother and father who may be less than honest to take this kid's money over the course of years. That money is earmarked for this kid, and it's got to be done in such a way that a bank is involved and the judge has to sign off on it. So Barron has to sign off on this multi-million-dollar settlement, and things are going well. Until one day, the lawyer, his name is Barinholtz, gets a call from the judge. He says, I want to see you. So Barinholtz goes over to see him. The judge says, take a walk with me. So they go outside, they're walking in front of the Supreme Court building around the little park that's there, and you know, I don't know how many of you followed the whole Gotti saga, but Gotti used to go on these walk talks.
Yeah.
And, they would walk through Little Italy, and this was so when I heard the story, I said, this was a walk talk. I mean, the Baron was not Gotti, but as it turns out, he was probably worse than Gotti. But in any event, that's what they did. And during that talk, the judge said to Baron Holtz, I'm gonna sign the papers. How much money are you getting out of this? The lawyer says, well, I'm getting a third of whatever it is, multi-million-dollar settlement. He said, and the kid and the mother are getting the rest. He said, yeah, a lot of money. He said, here's what's gonna happen. He said, I'm not signing those papers unless you pay me $250,000 before I sign the papers. Baron Holtz told me when I interviewed him, he said, I didn't know what to say, so I said, okay. So he presented the papers to Baron, signs them. This was in August. September, October, November, December. He never hears from the judge again. He figures, maybe I misheard, maybe I don't know. Anyway, right after Christmas, after New Year's, first day back, he's in his office, he gets a call. Guess who it was? Baron. He says, come see me. So he goes across. Baron was in a different building now. They had a kind of an annex Supreme Court building. He goes in and he walks into, judge opens the chamber's door and he walks in and he describes, Baron Holtz described to me that when he walked in, the judge locked the door. He said he turned this lock and you could hear clunk. I said, oh boy, what's this about? Baron now walks up to him and not at a distance, right in front of him, and whispers in his ear, I haven't forgotten. Where's my money? Baron Holtz now says, okay, Judge. He goes back to his office. He calls his lawyer, who just so happens was my former boss, first time in the DA's office. When I was in the Homicide Bureau, he was my chief. His name was Ronnie Aiello. He was a Supreme Court judge, and then he left the bench and became a private practice, went into private practice. He tells Aiello the story. Aiello calls Hines. I am at home watching a football game on a Sunday. I'll never forget. I was in the midst of a divorce at that point. I wasn't living home. I was living with my dad. And I'm sitting on the couch and I get the call, and Hines tells me, Aiello called, he wants you to meet this guy, Baron Holtz, the next day, something with a judge, payments, etc. I said, okay. So I called George Terra, who was the guy that called me up to tell me that I was on a hit list, and Joe Ponzi, who was the chief of our investigators in the DA's office. And I tell him what's going on, and I said, the guy's coming in tomorrow, and we need to talk to him. So George says to me, when I get into the office the next morning, I say, where are we gonna do this? George says, we can't do it here because everybody sees who's walking in at the DA's office. We're going after a judge. So what he did was he rented a room, a little conference room in the hotel that the DA's office was part of. We were part of the Brooklyn Marriott. The Marriott was the first 8 floors. We were from 10 to about 14, 19, something of that nature. So I said, okay. I walk into the Marriott with George and we're looking for the room. And we walk up to this door and there's a sign on the door. Like, I'm just gonna make this up, so-and-so Enterprises, whatever. I said, what did you do? He said, well, what was I gonna do? Put Brooklyn DA looking for a judge on the, he said, I gotta put this up. People are gonna see, what. So we walk in and we do it. We do the interview and Baron Holtz tells the story I just told you. So at the end of the story, I realized I knew what needed to be done. George and Ponzi knew what needed to be done. We needed to get the judge on tape. So George says to Baron Holtz, just before we leave, he says, Gary was his first name. He said, Gary, you got a sport jacket that you don't want anymore? He goes, yeah. He says, okay. He says, bring it next time I call you. So we Baron Holtz sets up a meeting with the judge on a particular day. That morning, he comes in to me early. George is there, and George takes the suit jacket. About 40 minutes later or so, he comes back with the jacket, and I said, "What'd you do?" He said, "I opened up the lapels, and we put the microphone into both sides." So why'd you do that? He said, "Well, he told us that he whispered in his ear. So if I gave him a regular recording device, it may not be picked up. So I had to get it so that he'd be able to talk into it this close, and they'd be able to record it." And we gave him a recorder. It's not like the movies, guys, where they put this ridiculous thing on the front, they put tape and all this other shit. It's not like that anymore. The recorder was probably about this big, the device. What did we do with it? We put it in his well, I don't remember if we did it with him, but what we used to do is sew it into the underwear, the band of your underwear. And it was wireless, of course, you know, the microphones. And sure enough, oh, and we also told him that we were gonna give him some money. So we said to Barinholtz, "Tell him you're gonna bring in 18 grand. So he looked at me and he said, "What do you mean 18 grand? He said, "Well," I said, "this is what you gotta do. If you took out an entire, and you're gonna do it in two $9,000 bundles, because if you go to a bank and you take out 10,000, then they have to file a suspicious activity report. Under 10,000, they don't have to do that. So I don't want this judge to go checking around to find out what we did and who did it, etc. So you tell them that you went to the bank twice and took out two $9,000 withdrawals, and here's the money." He goes, "Okay." So that day, now we had one additional problem. We had to send him in with the wired jacket, right? But there's a metal detector to get into the courthouse. So what George did was George wore the jacket, he's a cop, showed his shield right past the metal detector. Barinholtz came in dressed with some other jacket on, probably George's jacket, and they went to a bathroom, switched jackets, and he went into the chambers. And the whole thing was done, all on tape. He comes back, I listened to this, I said, "This is great." Somebody said to me, who worked with me, said, "Well, maybe we should do it again, maybe no one will believe this." I said, "Are you kidding me?" I can't run the risk that the judge is gonna find out, the judge is gonna, we got him now, he's on tape. So that was a Friday. The plan was to arrest him the next working day. Turns out it was Martin Luther King weekend. So we had to do it on Tuesday, not on Monday. So George says, and the DA says to me, by the way, he says, "You have to be out there when we arrest the judge, on the street." I said, "Okay." So George picks me up, drive all the way out. He lived in, any of you familiar with the shopping center at the end of Flatbush Avenue, King's Plaza Shopping Center in Brooklyn?
Yes.
So behind King's Plaza was a tennis club. The judge played tennis in the morning before coming into the office. So we knew that we needed to be out at his place, his home, surveilling the home very early in the morning, so we'd catch him on the way to the tennis club. So George and I sit there, he picks me up, we left about 3 a.m. to drive out there. So we get out there, it's about 4 a.m., we're sitting there, 5 a.m., no judge. 6, no judge. We said, "Oh, maybe this guy went away for the weekend, didn't come home." Just as we were about to leave and call the whole thing off, here comes the judge, out of his house into his car, and takes down the block. He goes down Flatbush Avenue, makes a left-hand turn on, I think it's Avenue U, and we had other cars ready to stop him. And they did, they pulled him over. I get out of George's car, George gets out, other guys had already had the judge out on the street. I walk up to him, and as he's getting out of his car, I hear him saying, fellas, it's okay." He says, "I'm a Supreme Court judge, you know, I'm sure everything's okay." We said, "That's why we want you, because you are a Supreme Court judge." He didn't know what the hell was happening. So we arrest him. I tell him, "You're under arrest for bribe receiving, etc., etc." I say, "You get in the car." So George is driving, I'm in the back seat with the judge, and it's a fairly good distance between that place and downtown Brooklyn. And as we're driving, I look over at the judge, and I tap George on the shoulder. He goes, "What's up?" I said, this fucking guy is sleeping. He fell asleep in the car, the judge. Fell asleep. He'd just been arrested. His entire life was about to be thrown into hell, and he was sleeping. George said to me, I heard this a million times from cops before. He said, that means he did it. Cops' theory is, and I used to see this when I would go to a precinct and interview a defendant, I'd say to the detectives, where is he? He said, he's in a holding cell, he's sleeping. The guy was arrested for murder. He said, it's a good sign, Mike, it means he did it. He said, think about it. If you had been arrested for murder and you didn't do it, you'd be screaming your head off, right? Would you go to sleep and fall asleep? No, of course you wouldn't. So George said to me, now we know he's guilty. Anyway, we do the case, and unfortunately for Judge Barron, he doesn't get a Brooklyn Supreme Court judge, because he couldn't. It would be a conflict. So the administrative judge for the state appoints an upstate judge. Nicholas Colabello was his name, from, I think, Westchester. So Colabello comes down first day to arraign him, and first thing he does is he asks everybody to stand for a moment of silence for those who were lost in 9/11. I look over at the defense attorney, who I knew, and he went like this. Oh no. He said, this is not some liberal judge that we got lucky getting. We got a guy who's a tough guy. And what did he have on his side? He had a gun in a holster, the judge. So I knew that this was going to be a tough road to hoe for this defendant. Anyway, he winds up pleading guilty. The day of the sentence for a Supreme Court judge, he was convicted based on his own plea. We were going to get him anyway. The news was on this like white on rice. It was really just unbelievable. So the day of the sentence, it was broadcast and it was on the news, and there was a young woman, from Russia, who was a Jewish woman who was in Brooklyn, watching the news. And she saw that the DA's office prosecuted a judge, and the judge got 3 to 9 years in prison. Now, why is that important? Because the next day, into our office comes this young woman, Frida Hanamoff is her name. And Frida walks in, speaks to an assistant DA, and tells him that she is before a judge in matrimonial court. It's a case involving her kids. Her husband, divorced husband, was trying to take her kids away, and custody was the issue. And the judge, whose name is Gerald Garson, was not acting very nicely towards her, and she was afraid that she was going to lose her kids. While in court one day, a guy tapped her on the shoulder and said, come outside, I want to talk to you. I know what's happening. And she says, what are you talking about? What do you mean? She says, I know why the judge's treating you so badly. She said, your husband paid him off. How do I know that? Because I know the judge. And I know that he takes bribes. Now, it wasn't totally correct, but what was correct is that the judge wasn't corrupt, and he was taking bribes. And who was he taking them from? He was taking them from a lawyer who was making sure that when he got a case referred to him by this guy, his name was Elman. Elman was a big deal in the Sephardic Jewish community in Brooklyn. And he would recommend people from his community who had problems to go to this lawyer, and the lawyer would ensure that the case would go before Judge Garson. How did he do that? Well, he paid off the clerk in the clerk's office, and he wound up paying off the court officer, and of course he had to take care of the judge. So Frida comes to us and tells us that this guy says he can pay off a judge, but he wants money. So George Terra comes to me and he says, Mike, we got this woman, and some of your colleagues don't think that she's telling that all the truth. He says, I believe her. Now, George has been around a long time. He was a cop for a long time. I did a lot of cases with him. I said, George, if you believe it, let me talk to her. So I did. And Frida walks into my office. she's attractive woman. She's from Russia, Russian Jew, came to the United States, a businesswoman, established a business, married a guy who was a really bad guy and was divorced from him. She had 3 kids. And when she walked in, she's pregnant. So, didn't mean anything to me at that point. You know, okay. She tells me the story. I said, George, what do you want to do? He says, well, this guy Elman wants money, and he's got a warehouse in eastern part of Brooklyn. And he says, I want to send Frida in to the warehouse with the money. So now he says, but I can't do it unless you tell me it's okay. So now I'm sitting there, I'm saying, am I going to take the chance and send this pregnant woman into a warehouse with a guy, we don't know anything about the guy, she'll be wired, but how can I take that chance? So I said to Frida speaks like this, she says, I will do it, don't worry, I will do it, I will do this, I'm not afraid. I said, George, you're going to be okay with this? He goes, don't worry, we'll be right outside, she'll be wired, we'll be right there, if we hear anything, the cavalry will rush in. So we do it. Send Frida in with, I forgot what it was, like $400 or something. We told her to tell him that this is what she had available now. But she wanted proof that this guy knew the judge. So he holds up his cell phone and shows her that he's got the judge's name and telephone number in the cell phone. He said, I told you I know him. But who did he really know? He knew the lawyer. And after this first encounter, everything went well. We got it all on tape. The guy stayed. She went off and other detectives took her back to the office. And George and another guy stayed to watch to see if there was any aftermath. And sure enough, out of this warehouse come 2 people, Elman, and as it turns out, it was the lawyer who was paying off the judge. And they embrace outside. Big hug, they're smiling, laughing. Because Frida has agreed now to pay this guy several $1,000s to take care of the judge. Wow. The lawyer's name was Paul Simonovsky. And we were able to get enough on tape because we wound up tapping Elman's phone, his business phone. We wound up tapping his cell phone, and we were able to get enough information and heard Simonovsky talking about stuff that they were doing, that we then were able to get a tap on Simonovsky's cell and his business phone. Now this is tapping a lawyer's office. So we were, it was very, very, we had to walk and do this very carefully and make sure we were doing the right thing, because there's all, attorney-client privilege, you have to worry about that. Mm-hmm. So, I said, listen, we're all big boys and girls. We'll figure out how to do this the right way. Let's just do it. Now, I gotta tell you, one of the funny things about it is, Simonovsky's office, let's say the DA's office was at the end of this is the DA's office. There was a street, kind of a very small street that ran down to Fulton Street, the main street in downtown Brooklyn where the stores and all kinds of stuff. Simonovsky's office was on the corner of Fulton and this little street. Across that little street was a Burger King restaurant. So we tapped his phone, and the detectives, and he was on the 2nd floor. Thank God, Burger King had a 2nd floor dining room. So we had detectives in the dining room watching when we knew Simonovsky or Elman was going to, when we knew Elman was going to be in the office. So we watched, and we got Elman connected to the office, and then we went and got the tap on Simonovsky's phone, and we listened and listened. And ultimately we had enough to realize that this guy was bribing Gerald Garson. One other little factor. In Frida's case, her kids had to have a lawyer because her kids needed representation in this custody battle. Guess who her lawyer was?
You?
Simonovsky. Simonovsky. So he was getting paid from the state. He was going to get money from Elman when they were fixing the judge. It was just disgusting, just disgusting. So let me tell you what we did. We had enough. We had watched, oh, I forgot one thing. After we had enough evidence to do the next step, which was to put a recording device and a camera, TV camera, in the judge's chambers. I came up with the idea, and I called in a guy who has been in the office in Rackets longer than me, and I sat him down, and I said, Chris, this is what we want to do. I want to put a camera and a recording device in the judge's chambers because I know that's where he's committing the crimes. He said to me, again, excuse my French, are you fucking crazy? He said, are you nuts? You can't do that. I said, why not? He says, you just can't. It's never been done. I said, really? Okay. Well, now it's going to be done. So now I have to get the permission to get the wiretap signed. I have to go to the administrative judge of Brooklyn. And I walk into her office and I say her because she was brand new. Why? Because in the other case with Judge Barron, the administrative judge who took it on the chin because Barron was a corrupt guy, they basically forced him upstairs. They got him out of there, put a new judge in, and I sat down with her and I introduced myself, and I could tell when I introduced myself by her face, she knew what was coming. I said, Judge, it's happened again. She says, you're kidding. I said, no. I said, but this time it's worse. Told her what the story was. She signed the papers immediately. Now we had enough to put camera and a recording device in the judge's chambers and watch him and talk to Simonovsky, talk to other people. It was just unbelievable. So how do we do this? I needed to get someone from the clerk's office to be able to get us into the courthouse after, at 11, 12 o'clock at night. We couldn't do it during the day. And the judge, the matrimonial part was in another building away from the courthouse. It was in the Brooklyn Municipal Building. Big, huge building, all people in and out. So I go to the clerk's office, and I knew a guy in the clerk's office who's the chief clerk, and I trusted him. And I told him what we needed, and I said, we'll meet you in front of the courthouse, whatever you say, whatever day is good for you, but we'll do it 11 o'clock, 11:30, 12 o'clock at night. So anyway, we do. George goes, we have a guy who's a specialist at doing this stuff, and he walks into the judge's chambers, and now he's got to find places to secrete the recording device and the camera. So he said the recording device was easy. Next to the judge's desk on the wall was an old telephone switching box. I don't know if you remember these they were like this big, the screw in the middle, you open it up and the telephone wires are in there. Not used anymore, of course. Took it off, put the recording device in there. That was good. Now the camera. Where are we going to put the camera? So Steve was the guy's name. Steve tells me later on, he said, so I look around, look above, and he said, right over the judge's desk, these kind of tiles, right above his desk, the corner of one of the tiles was broken off. So you could look up and it was dark. Why? Because there was nothing there. So just the broken, he said, that was perfect, perfect. He put the camera in. The camera was maybe about this big, right? Everything is great. We were watching the next day, first day of court, across the street, a long street, a big street, from that courthouse. The DA's office was diagonally across the street, and I'm in the wire room. Camera comes up, court, and there's people in the judge's chambers, and we see people walking like this, breaking up. Then what? Oh no! I said to him, what is going on? He said, Mike, this is old equipment. He said, that must be the problem. This is old equipment. It's not like, you're watching television. This is no good. I said, shut it off. I go to the DA and I tell him what the problem is. I say, we need state-of-the-art recording equipment. Is it okay to go buy it? So he gave me the okay. We bought it. Week or two later, we do the same thing, put the thing in, turn on the camera the next day. It was like I was watching television at home. It was clear as a bell. It was great. And for the next month or more, we watched Garson, Simonovsky, and others commit crime after crime after crime that changed. So I say, listen, I want an inside person. I want to make this solid because we're going after a Supreme Court judge. No one has ever done this before. No state prosecutor has ever locked up or prosecuted a Supreme Court judge, and we were going to be the first. Well, second judge. We already did Barrett, but nobody ever done this. So I said I want a solid case. So we decide that we're going to pick up Simonovsky. He's the weak link, we figure, because he's the briber. He's got a lot to lose. So we pick him up. And he lived in Bayside in Queens. Big apartment building. Gets into his car. He's driving along, I guess it was Astoria. We followed him all the way in. He was going to go down Astoria Boulevard and he was going to go on to the BQE and go into Brooklyn. George is following him in a car with another detective. And we had a car in front of him. So the female detective, I forgot her name for a second. But anyway, she calls Simonovsky's phone. And she says to him, his cell phone. And she says, this is AT&T, we need to check the phone. And she keeps him on the phone. Why did we do that? Because we wanted to make sure that he didn't call his office if he noticed the police cars or noticed our unmarked cars and tipped people off. We didn't want that to happen. So we tied up his phone with this phone call, pulled him over, got him out of the car. Of course, like, what kind of thing. George says to him, get in the car. Get in the car. Where are we going? You'll see. George had arranged. We couldn't take him to downtown Brooklyn. Too many eyeballs. We had to keep this secret. We take him to Fort Hamilton Army Base in Brooklyn, which is on the edge of the water, basically underneath the Verrazano Bridge. It is as lonely and as out of the way as you can imagine. The Criminal Investigation Division of the Army has a building there that George, we've done work with them, and they said you can use our offices to do this. So we bring Simonovsky to the Criminal Investigation Division. It's cold, there's snow on the ground, and believe me when I tell you, if that would scare the living hell out of me, if I was handcuffed and I had to be brought into this place. I'll give you what happened later on. The judge who I had gone to get the paper signed, at some point was talking to me about something, and she said, so where did you take him? To the gulag? I said, yeah. So that became the kind of the code word for the criminal investigation, because believe me, it was desolate. It was cold. It was snow on the ground. There was nothing around. So Simonovsky comes in, he sits down. I sit down with other detectives, and I tell him why he's there. And I tell him, he's kind of skeptical. I said, really? Skeptical? Okay, I'll tell you what. How about this? Your son, who I don't know these people from Adam, I said, your son's name is so-and-so. This is how old he is. And he had this, and this to do, and you were talking about it. Well, that got his attention. And I said, and you broke Garson's candy dish because you stuck your hand in one day and it fell off the desk. He goes, how did you know that? I said, I told you. We had it wired for sound and for video. He looked around the table and he said, turned to me and he said, I'll speak to you, but nobody else. You and I alone. I said, okay. Everybody left. Now, we had given him his Miranda warnings already. So I said, Paul, what do you want to say? He goes, I know what you want. You want me to cooperate? I said, yeah. He said, I will, but you got to promise me one thing. I didn't know what was coming. He said, you can't let my wife know about my affair with my secretary. That's what he was worried about. He had been bribing a judge for years. He was going to go to jail, lose his license, go into prison. He's worried about his wife picking up us telling. I said, I have no interest in telling your wife about your your affair with your secretary. So he said, okay. We wired him up that day, and he was, as luck would have it, he was meeting the judge for lunch. So it was perfect. So anyway, that started several months of him talking to the judge, meeting the judge. They would meet in the Marriott Hotel, had a bar and a restaurant. They would go there. They would sit for hours, and a bill would come. Simonowski would take the bill. Garson never paid. Garson one time said to Simonowski, I really am in a little bit of trouble in terms of money. If you have any cash, you can lend me. He goes, no problem. Picks up the phone, calls. We're recording all of this. Picks up the phone, calls the secretary who he was having the affair with, who was still in the office. I guess they were going to meet later, and tells her, come to the other guy, and he goes, what he did was he told her that he wanted her to go into some place in the office and get cash, bring it to him in the Marriott. So we knew this was happening. So when at some point, Simonowski gets up from the table, goes to the entrance to the restaurant, comes back, and he tells Garson, I'll meet you in the bathroom. And he paid him the money in the bathroom. And we found out what he was doing in the bathroom because we couldn't tape that, but he did tell us later on. So that's how that was the relationship that these two had. What he was doing was he was ensuring, I told you, that his cases would get before Garson. He was bribing Garson with dinners, lunches, liquor, fine wine, anything Garson wanted. And we also noticed that Garson was a big cigar smoker. So when we finally got to the point where we wanted to kind of bring this to a head and get him accepting something that we could see, we had one of our detectives go to a cigar store and buy a box of really good cigars, Romeo and Juliet cigars. So Simonowski's on trial with the judge, and the judge is telling him, on tape, we're hearing this, what you need to ask the witnesses, how you need to ask the witnesses, what you need to say. And Simonowski played it dumb. He said, I don't know. He said, don't worry about it. He says, you're going to win. That was a great line. You got this. You're going to win. He says, so Simonowski comes back the next day and gives him a box of Romeo and Juliet and one single cigar, same cigar. Judge starts to sing. Romeo and Juliet, this is great. And on the tape, we're hearing this. He didn't, of course, Simonowski was gone. Takes the single cigar, lights it up, even though he's not supposed to be smoking. I'm sorry, didn't light it up. He took the wrapper off and put it in his mouth and held it at his desk. He loved it. He put the box of cigars in his desk, and when he left that night, he took the cigars out and took off. So we had now, in my opinion, what I thought was a great case, but I wanted it even better. I said to Simonowski one day, does he take money? He goes, yeah, of course he takes money. He said, listen, I owe the guy money. Here's how he takes it. He refers clients to me because he knows that I'll get them before him, and I'll take care of them. So I owe him now a quote-unquote referral fee for about $1,000 at this point. So if you give me money, when I go in, he'll expect it. It won't be a surprise. I said, okay. So we put 10 $100 bills in a white envelope, send them over to the chambers, and he sits down and he walks in and he takes the envelope and he tosses it. And he says, this is what I owe you. Judge looked at it, opened it, looked at it, and said, okay, opens the door, puts the envelope in his desk. He said, I'm watching this. I said, great, now we really have it. Talks a little bit, Simonowski leaves. I stay watching. Judge takes the money out now, counts it, puts it back into the drawer, and picks up the phone and calls Simonowski. Guys, I almost died. I said, oh no, he's gonna give it back to him. That's what I was fearful of. Calls him in, Simonowski goes back, sits down, goes, what's up? shows him the envelope. He said, you gave him cash. Simonowski says, yeah. He said, I think probably you should just take the cash, but write a check to my wife's campaign fund instead of the cash. Simonowski, now smart, he got good as an undercover, and he said, don't worry about it. He throws the envelope back to him and says, keep the cash, I'll write the check anyway. Garson says, great. Puts the thing back in his desk. Simonowski leaves, we watched, and what did Garson do? Took it out, counted it again, took 3 $100 bills, put them in his pocket, the rest he put into the drawer. We had him. So, we were gonna arrest him. Now, just before we do get to this point, Simonowski was talking to him, I told you all the time, talking to him about cases and all kinds of things. During one particular conversation, Judge Garson starts to complain to Simonowski about his cousin, Michael Garson, who was also a Brooklyn Supreme Court judge. What was he complaining about? Michael Garson was the guardian of their aunt's estate, her money. He took care of all of the money. She was an elderly person. And Gerald Garson is complaining to Michael because Michael tells him that he's been skimming off the top. He's been taking this woman's money, paying tuition for his daughter, this, that, and Garson is now livid. Not because they're stealing from the aunt, but because Gerald Garson was supposed to be it was an heir, so if the woman died, there was less for him now than there would have been if Michael hadn't been stealing it. It was just unfucking believable. So anyway, after we locked up Gerald Garson, and I'll tell you how we did that in a second. We also then brought his cousin in, Michael Garson. Michael was very smart. Michael didn't play any games. Michael said, I'll give up my judgeship. I'll give up my law license. Don't put me in jail. The DA felt sorry for him and gave him a deal. Lost his judgeship, lost his law license. And then, I forgot what we did. I think we gave him, he was fine or something of that nature. So now it was time to lock up Gerald. So George had his guys following Garson every morning from his home. Garson lived on the Upper East Side, off First Avenue, in like the 70s. So he would come out every morning with his little dog and walk his dog, and then he would get in his car and drive to Brooklyn. One morning, the detectives were there. He had come out after walking the dog, and they scooped him up. Where we bring him? To the gulag. He's in the gulag. He said, I want my lawyer. I said, fine. We go get his lawyer. Sit him down. He says, the lawyer said to me, what do you got? You got nothing. I said, really? You think so? You think I have nothing? Let me show you. We wheel in a big screen TV on a cart that the Army detectives lent us. I had a videotape, put it in, and there he is, taking the money, doing this and everything. So the lawyer looks at me and he says, can I have a moment with my client alone for a second? I said, sure. I go into another part of the office and I'm sitting there waiting, and the lawyer comes in to me and he says, he wants to help himself. He can give you Clarence Norman Jr. I said, wow. So who is Clarence Norman Jr.? Clarence Norman Jr. was the head of the Brooklyn Democratic Party. He was the third ranking assembly person in New York State. He was a big political maca. He was a guy who can make or break candidates. Any judge who became a judge in Brooklyn had to make sure that Clarence put the imprimatur on it. So Clarence was a big deal. And what we knew Clarence was doing was taking money to put people onto the bench. That's what we were really after. So we said to the judge, good, here's what you got to do. I want you to go to lunch with him. We're going to wire you. I need you to get him to talk about this stuff. Bring it up. Garson was horrible at being an undercover. He was horrible. He got nothing. But what he did do was he got us a little bit of pieces of information that I gave to my guys and gals, and we checked them out, and we were able to get enough evidence on Norman to show that he was a corrupt assemblyman. He was stealing from his own campaign coffers. He was extorting money out of people around the state in return for introducing legislation that would help them. And he was also extorting money from judicial candidates by telling them that if you don't do what I tell you, and you don't hire my guy to do your campaign literature, my guy to do your public relations, I have no interest in helping you. And the judges knew, without Clarence imprimatur, you don't become a judge. So, I had him. We had him. We had enough. We had more than enough, and I turned someone who was sort of the secretary of the Brooklyn Democratic Association, who knew that if he played his cards the wrong way, handcuffs were going on him as well. So he helped us. He reluctantly became a witness for us. So let me just tell you what happened the day that Clarence was supposed to be arrested. So we had arranged, we indicted him. I indicted him 4 times, 4 separate times. He was supposed to surrender to me about 6 o'clock on, I'll just pick a day, Tuesday night. So I knew what was happening, and I'm on my desk maybe about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I get a call from my now deceased sister, Pam. And she says, I said, Pam, what's up? Because my father was elderly, but he was okay. He was still working. I said, Dad, okay? He goes, yeah, it's not Dad. I said, what's up? She said, you better come home. I said, why? He said, the house has been burglarized. He lived downstairs. I had an apartment upstairs. I said, are you kidding? He goes, no. She said, no, get home. So I get in the car, drive home. My uncle, who lived down the street, was there with his wife, and I walk up to the steps, and he goes, you sure you want to go in? I said, why? He says, Mike. Not Mike. They only call me Michael. Michael, it's a mess. It's horrible. I said, Uncle Louie, I gotta go in. So I go in, and I look on the first floor, and my father's apartment was hardly nothing. It was nothing. I said, Uncle Louie, what are you talking about? He said, your apartment. I walked up the stairs. I couldn't take a step into the apartment without stepping all over everything that I owned. They had emptied every drawer, emptied my closets, threw stuff on the floor. My desk was empty. They stole every one of by that point I had been in the DA's office, and I had been promoted several times. All of my my DA shields, all stolen. My watches, all stolen. I had an envelope of cash that I was going to use for Christmas presents, stolen. The only thing that they missed, buried in the back of next to a closet in an old briefcase of mine, was money cash that I was going to use to pay my son's tuition in high school. No. They didn't get that. But everything else, destroyed. I said, so he said, it's not it. It's not the only thing. He said, go to the basement. We go down to the basement. We had a finished basement. There was a bathroom down there. And what they had done is they stuffed the commode with toilet paper rolls, paper towel rolls, and someone defecated into it and flushed the toilet. So there were feces, water all over the basement. So bad that we had to have the entire basement, the walls taken down and rebuilt because of that. It was horrific. I had to go back to the office at that point to get Norman. So at the same time, I'll just mention this, at the same time I was doing an investigation. Seems like it's all I did at this point. There was one lead to the other, into 2 retired police detectives. They're now known as the Mafia cops. 2 detectives who were on the Mafia payroll for years, killing people, tipping them off to informants, etc. Eppolito and Caracappa. We were in the midst of that investigation. And when I told my friend Tommy Days about what happened with the burglary, he said, one of two things. Either they know what we're doing, or Norman knew what was happening, and they got somebody to, to do this. The side door was kicked in. My uncles, thank God, were able to at least get the doors closed. That door, not fixed, but secure that night. And Norman comes in, he reports, and the DA was very nice to him. Instead of putting him in the Brooklyn House of Detention for the night, the DA told us to get a cot for him. He fell asleep in the detective area. So the next morning, I had to arraign him, and I had to bring him over to court. So they had to bring him over to court. And I'm in court, waiting for him to show up. And here he comes. Of course, he had an entourage. He had all kinds of people outside, inside the courtroom. And he walks in his suit, and he's got handcuffs on. They didn't even handcuff him behind, they handcuffed him in front. So he walks in, and everybody's going, whoa, whoa. And here's what he does. He holds up his hands, and he goes, don't worry, just another kind of bling bling. And I said, this guy doesn't think he's going to walk away from this. So we arraigned him, and of course, before we did that, the DA actually called him in and gave him an opportunity to save himself. Saturday afternoon, I'm in his office, he calls in Norman, and he tells him, he said, listen, we got you. We're getting ready to file these indictments. You can help yourself. Who paid for the judgeships? That's what we want to know. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know. I don't know, you can get me, that kind of thing. We said, okay. 4 indictments later, he's now in court and he has to be arraigned. We had another judge from out of the county, a guy from the Bronx, Marty Marcus. This guy was tremendous. He was just a great judge. And, I had, at the same time, we were doing the Mafia Cops investigation. Oh, I forgot to tell you, there was another little investigation I was involved in at the exact same time. It was a former FBI agent who was getting ready to indict for 4 murders that he had committed back when he was working as an FBI agent. So we had that going at the same time. So Clarence decides that he's going to test us and go to trial. And we had picked out, when I say we, myself and the other assistant DA who were going to try the case, had picked out of the 4, we had a choice of which one we were going to try first. And we picked out the one that we thought was the strongest. Well, Norman's people knew that it was the strongest as well, and they did everything possible to try to get us to try to get that case delayed, put aside. They've done everything. They filed appeals for documents. They said we didn't turn over things. So the judge says to me one day, he says, Mike, pick another one. You got 4, pick another one. And he didn't know that I had picked the best. So I picked one, and it wasn't the best. It was actually one of the weaker of the indictments. And, but I had no choice. So we go to trial, pick a jury, and I'll never forget this. He gets on the witness stand in his own defense. His lawyer, who used to be actually my boss in the DA's office, another boss, puts him on the witness stand, and he starts talking about what he did, what he didn't do. I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't know that you couldn't accept this limits on campaign contributions. That was what it was about, basically. So, and he's looking at the jury, and he's smiling, and he's dressed to the nines, and he was a very glib guy, a guy who really was a good politician. And the jury was, we're Brooklynites, they're looking at him, and he was smiling at them. And so I did something that I learned from another attorney back a little while ago. I didn't forget this stuff. So I stood up at the podium like this. Jury's over there. He's on the stand here. And every time they would ask, his lawyer would ask a question, the lawyer would ask the question from here. So Norman would look at him, but also all he had to do was kind of glance over, and his face was, he was looking at the jury and smiling, etc. I said, not going to work. Here's what I did. So I started asking the questions. Where did I stand? I stood over here. So he had to answer with me, and if he started to turn to the jury every time he answered, they would get the point that he was doing it for their benefit rather than being honestly asking questions. So it worked. The lawyer asked him a question on direct, and his answer was, I didn't know the law about campaign contributions, limits on campaign contributions. And I'm sitting at my desk and I'm saying to myself, please, end this now. End this now. I gotta get up to question him. No further questions. I asked him a few preliminary questions, and I finally said to him, so you told this jury that you didn't know about this law that put limits on campaign contributions. Yes, sir, I did not know that. I said, and that's what you told the jury and you want them to believe that? Yes, sir. So I reach over to the desk. One of my colleagues gives me something, and I mark it for identification, mark it into whatever it is. I forgot if I put it into evidence. And I walk up to him and I hand it to him. And I say, take a look at that. He says, yeah, what is it? What is it? I said, I don't know what this is. I said, that's the law that you say you didn't know anything about, right? That's the actual bill. He goes, well, if you say so. I said, look at the last page. Whose signature is on the last page as the person who wrote this law and sponsored it? His lawyer wanted to crawl under the table. How he didn't know about this, he looked. He said, so I said, it's you, right? That's you. This is your law. You did this. Mark it into evidence. I knew that was the issue. He gets convicted. When the jury comes out and they say guilty, the lawyer yelled in the courtroom, oh no! I said, oh yes. What happens after the trial's over, my colleague meets one of the jurors, actually the foreperson. She lived in the same neighborhood and she recognized him, he recognized her. So she said to him, we had no trouble convicting this guy. He says, well, why? She said, well, first of all, we knew that he was lying with that question, what I just told you about. Second of all, he's a politician. He's a liar. All politicians are liars. And that was it. And I knew, and I convicted him 2 other times. Of the 4 indictments, I convicted him for 3 out of the 4. The 4th one, the only reason we didn't get him is because the judge's charge to the jury about what they should consider was very confusing. And they told us later on, when I straightened it out with them in the hallway, I said, oh, we didn't realize that from the judge. So I would have had him 4 times. I had him 3. After the first conviction, I brought him into the office, sat him down, and gave him the same opportunity as the DA did. Help us with the judge buying judgeships, and we'll give you a break. No jail time. He was chewing gum like an arrogant guy that he was. He said, I can't help you. I said, okay. Well, at the end of the 4 indictments, he gets sentenced, sentencing day. He comes into court, and judge sentences him to 3 to 9 years. He goes into the back, into the corrections department, and we see somebody getting called in to the back, and the person coming out. It was someone, I don't know if it was one of my guys or somebody, and I said, what's going on? My colleague said to me, Mike, you know what this guy brought? He brought his iPod and earphones. He brought snacks. He thought he was going to camp. He said he's going to get on the bus to go to Attica or wherever, and he's got an iPod and snacks. He said they had to take it away from him. He said, what? This is the kind of mentality this guy had. So by this point now, we had 3 Supreme Court judges convicted. We had, I thought we started to kind of diminish the politicians in Brooklyn fairly regularly, and then I get a call from the City Department of Investigation, who investigates city employees. They come in and tell me that there's an assemblywoman in East New York by the name of Diane Gordon, who is corrupt. And here's how they know this. There is a big plot of land in her assembly area that a developer wants to develop and put up low-income housing. and he wants to make sure that the city council approves him. So he goes to Diane Gordon and says, I need your help, it's your district, it's good for your constituents. She says, yeah, all of that's great. Basically, I'm not doing this for nothing. Here's what I want. On the other side of, this was in East New York, on the other side of where this was going to be built was Ozone Park, Queens. He was building a big development of not low-income housing, but higher-income housing, homes. She said, I'll do this for you, but I want you to build me a home. I want you to give it to me for nothing. Worth about $500,000, and to cover, to make sure that nobody, give me a mortgage. And what I'll do is I'll pay you a little bit for the first couple of months to cover, and then at the end of those couple of months, you forgive the mortgage and you give the money back to me that I already met. We sent this guy in to her office to iron out all the details. She repeated this entire scheme on tape, and we had her. So I go to the arraignment and arraign her on the charges. I go to explain the whole thing to the judge, and I get a reporter from Channel 4, John Noel. Unfortunately, he's a great guy, but John, he died recently, but he and I knew each other. So I'm outside the courthouse, and he walks up to me and he said, so Mike, what do you think about what her lawyer said? Her lawyer said that, she had changed her mind. She really wasn't going to go through with it. So my answer to him, my response was, John, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. That's it. It's too late. So she gets convicted after trial. She went to jail as well. So now we had 3 Supreme Court judges. We had the Assemblywoman, and we had the mafia cops, because they had been indicted by the feds. The feds stole the case from us. And I had indicted the FBI agent. I'm not going to get into the FBI agent. It's too tough for me to talk about. I can't do it. And we wound up having to dismiss the case for a reason that still baffles me. But the DA wanted to dismiss. Anyway, that's beside the point. But in between all of this, when we were doing the FBI agent case, I had brought from AdMax, which is the most secure prison in the entire country in Colorado, a witness into the office, a guy by the name of Gregory Scarpa. And his father, Greg Scarpa, was basically a hitman for the Colombo family. He was a guy who everybody answered to, and he was, even though he was a made guy, he wasn't a capo, didn't want to be, because he didn't have to be. The Colombo hierarchy knew who he was and let him operate the way he wanted to be. When I was speaking to Gregory, came into the office, introduced himself, and before I even got down to talking to him, he said to me, by the way, Mike, he said, I got a message from Gas Pipe Casso, another wise guy from the Lucchese family. He's with me in AdMax. He wants to talk to you. I said, okay, I got enough on my plate right now. We'll get to Casso another time. So I spent a year with Gregory Scarpa, putting together this case against this FBI agent. And man, I gotta tell you, it's like listening to, I had nightmares, him telling me the stuff that he did. So one of the things that stuck in my mind, and I'll tell you about it, is that he said to me, so you grew up in Brooklyn, right? I said, yeah. He said, when you grew up, you played ball with your father and he teaches it? I said, yeah, he taught me how to catch. We played catch, throw a football, and I used to play ball. He said, well, my father taught me how to kill people. That's what my growing up was about. And he said, so he showed me, and one of the things he made sure that I remembered was after I shot and killed the guy, I had to put the gun behind his ear and shoot him again to make sure that he was dead. Yeah. This is the kind of person that you're dealing with. And I said, but Gregory, and I say Gregory because by the time a year passed, we were taking pictures together. I mean, I had brought his family in. He was a witness, and I let his mother and his sister come in. They would bring in lunch, you know, macaroni and all kinds of stuff, and they're sitting in my conference room and they're eating. He loved us, and he was at the MCC in Manhattan. That's where he was staying while he was with us. And he came in one day, and I said, "Gregory, you look horrible. What happened?" He says, "Well, first of all, I'm in jail." I said, "Yeah, I understand that, but you look worse than." He said, "Did you get any sleep?" He said, "Mike, you got to understand. I'm in a room in my cell. They don't turn the lights off. The light is on 24 hours a day." He said, "So I can't really, can't really sleep that well." So Gregory, at the end of the trip, I told you, wanted me to, gave us a lot of information, and he was just looking for me to write a letter to help him out because he was on the cusp of perhaps getting out. He hadn't been arrested for the murders, any of the murders that he did, but he was in there for something else. So during my discussion with him, I said, "How many murders did you do?" He said, "I don't know, 20, maybe." I said, "Oh, shit." I said, "Did your father ever tell you how many he did?" He said, "My father told me that he stopped counting at 35. Wow. His father was so bad that when the feds had him, they called him Lucifer. That was his, he was a bad guy, Greg Scarpa. And I'll tell you just one thing, talk about karma. So he had a real problem with his stomach when he was out, and he was operating as a Colombo hitman. He was all over the place. But he had a problem with his stomach, and he went into the hospital, and he needed to have an operation. He needed to have his stomach either taken out or pierced or cut, whatever it was. But he needed blood. So he was afraid at that point to have any blood taken from the blood bank in the hospital. He was a racist. I don't know where that blood came from, Could be this, could be that. So he ordered people in his crew to line up at the hospital and give blood so that he knew where it was coming from and he would use it in the operation. And they did. They had the operation. Shortly thereafter, he contracts HIV, gets AIDS. Why? One of his guys was an intravenous drug user and took steroids because he was a weightlifter. He had blood that was contaminated, and he gave it to Scarpa, and Scarpa died of it. So, so I got two more things I just want to talk about. One was I told you that gas pipe wanted to see me, right? So after all of these cases were done, myself, George Terra, Joe Ponzi go down to North Carolina to Prison Hospital where gas pipe was. He had prostate cancer. Butner, North Carolina. And we go in, go into the prison. They take us into this big room, and there's nobody there. We're going to bring gas pipe after we got into the room. So we're standing around waiting for him to come. He walks in. And this is a guy who, this guy killed more people than you could possibly imagine. He was just a murder incorporated himself. So I expected, guy to walk in, look like somebody who could kill 45 people, whatever it was. He's a little guy like this, thin. I said to myself, holy shit, this guy is just not what I expected. I had seen him on TV, but I had seen him, just for the way stuff when he's being interviewed. So George introduces himself, Joe Ponzi introduces himself, and I'm about to introduce myself, and he goes, "I know who you are." He said, "There's a lot of guys in here who have your picture on the wall and they throw darts at you." So I said, "Come on." He goes, No, I'm kidding." Okay. So anyway, I said to him, my book, I don't have it anymore, we sold them, it's called Friends of the Family, which was about the mafia cops. I said, "Did you read the book?" He goes, yeah, I read the book. And I said, "So what'd you think?" He goes, about 95% accurate. I said, "I'll take it. If that's what you're saying, okay." So he wanted to talk to us because he was looking for help. He wanted me to write a letter to him for him to the judge to reduce the sentence. I said to him, you are doing 17 life sentences plus 436 years. Are you kidding me? He goes, I gotta try. And so he started to tell us about these cold cases that he was involved in, and I'll just tell you about one of them. So he talks about killing this guy. And I said, what'd you do with him? He said, I'll tell you where the body is. He said, it's on such and such a street in Carroll Gardens, where I lived, and he's buried in the floor. I said, okay, got the address. We go down there after it's over, and I find out this big, brand new Italian restaurant is in that spot. That's the storeroom for the Italian restaurant. We walk in the back. This place had just opened. By the way, it was a very good Italian restaurant. Frankie's 57, I think it was called, 457. I walk in, I'm with George, and I said, George, we can't tear up this restaurant looking for this body. How are we gonna do that? He goes, Mike, I agree with you. Because he said he's buried in the floor. They had concreted over, they had made all kinds of shelves, all kinds. So that was one, and the other one he told us about was he told us where a gun that he used to kill someone was dumped into Sheepshead Bay. Told us exactly where it was. Said, okay, we'll give it a shot. So we got the PD divers. They were in there for days looking for this. And we're talking about years. There's no way that gun was going to be in that spot. I couldn't help him out. Went back to talk to him. He gave me more information, but I said, listen, Anthony, he hated, by the way, hated to be called gas pipe. Hated it. I said, I knew what the reason was, because the reason they called him gas pipe is because his father, who was a wise guy, was an enforcer. And the way he used to get money out of people who owed money to the wise guys, he would take a muffler pipe from a car, and he would carry that around, and he'd beat the hell out of people if they didn't give him the money. That was his job. So that was gas pipe. And before I left, I said to him, listen, you got to tell me one other thing if you want me to do anything for you. Where is the body of Jimmy Heidel? Now, Jimmy Heidel was the guy that the mafia cops picked up at his insistence to tell him, meaning Gas Pipe, who and why Gas Pipe had a hit put out of by Gotti, and he wanted to know who was involved. And so they picked up Jimmy Heidel, and the only reason we found out that the mafia cops were involved is because they showed up at Heidel's house one day looking for Jimmy. And his mother was home, and they wanted to know where Jimmy was, and she told them that he's not home. They ultimately get him in Brooklyn. And after the, so she doesn't, and then he doesn't show up, obviously he doesn't come home, because they pick him up, bring him to Gas Pipe kills him, tortures him, and kills him to get information out of him, and then dumps his body. Now, Mrs. Heidel did not know where the body was. And I asked Gas Pipe. He said he's in, I took him to a spot in Brooklyn, that was in Georgetown, Brooklyn, which is way over by the Atlantic Ocean. We're building this big housing development, big, huge housing development. He said we knew the guy who operated one of the machines there, and we gave him the body to him. He buried it, and then they concreted over the whole thing the next day. So, told Mrs. Heidel, she was just happy to know that she found out where her son Jimmy was. So, all right, let me just finish up, and I'll give you one last little bit. We've got 15 minutes. I'll do this quickly and open it for questions. So I thought that after all of this stuff, the FBI agent, 2 mafia cops, 3 Supreme Court judges, the Diane Gordon, that things were over, things were done. Sitting at my desk one day, an assistant DA walks in who was on the writing schedule. He was on call that day. He walks in and he says, Mike, you got a minute? I said, yeah. He said, I got a woman and a detective in my office, and she's buying a funeral home, or bought a funeral home in Bensonhurst, the Daniel George Funeral Home. And she when she finally got the books, she realized that the owner had stiffed her for $300,000 worth of prepaid funerals. And she went to the detectives because she wanted them to do something about it. And he says, but then she tells me that when she went into the funeral home one day to look around, she went upstairs and found this room that was kind of out of the way, and she walked in, and there were guys in scrubs. And there was a cadaver in there, it was a body. And they were at the body doing, and She walks up to him and says, what are you guys doing? The guy looked at her, she said, one of them looked at her and just said, well, we're stealing his bones, stealing the tissue. She didn't think anything of it, except she mentioned it as offhandedly in this meeting. So Josh Hanshaft, as the assistant, walks in and he says, Mike, so what do you want me to do? You want me to investigate the 300,000, or you want me to investigate the fact that they're stealing bone out of cadavers without people's permission? I said, Josh, are you kidding? That's what we're gonna do. This led us to an investigation in which a guy by the name of Michael Mastromarino, a formerly very, very highly rated dental surgeon who lost his business because he was addicted to Demerol, to a drug, and would operate on people under the influence of the drug. And in one instance, the final instance, he fell asleep in the middle of the operation. He lost his license. He wrote books. He was well regarded. He was making millions of dollars. Had a big home in Fort Lee, New Jersey, and now that was all taken away because he lost his license. He knew that bone was important for implant surgery and other types of surgery, and he also knew that it was hard to come by. There were processing companies all around the country where if they were lucky enough to get bone to process, they would do it, and then a doctor would call down there and get a piece of bone if they needed it for dental surgery, etc. But it wasn't enough. But he knew that it was very, very lucrative because of the shortage. So he decided to try to get, this funeral home, he got to know the funeral director, and he cut a deal with him, said, listen, when you get a new body in here, let me talk to the family. I want to talk to them about giving me the permission to take the bone and tissue. So he said, okay, and he did. How many people you think said, okay?
Zero.
Correct, 0. So he wasn't stopping there, so he decided, okay, I'll do it without their permission. And he cut a deal with funeral homes all over the metropolitan area to get first dibs on a body. They would clean out the bone, clean out whatever tissue. Then they would sew up the body if it was going to be waked. If it was going to be cremated, that was like a bonus. They didn't have to worry about anything. They would just cremate the body. One story was that after these guys would take bone and tissue out of the body and they had to sew it up, sometimes it would look not so right. The leg or the arm would look a little flat, whatever. So what they did was they first bought PVC pipe from Home Depot, and they would put the PVC pipe and then sew up the body. Sometimes that wasn't even enough. So what they would do is they would take whatever they had, like if they were eating lunch and they had paper or cups or leftover half hamburgers, they would stuff all of that garbage into the bodies and then sew it up. Now, of course, when we found out about this, we wound up finding 1,000 cases in Brooklyn. We also we found out that he'd done this in Jersey, Pennsylvania, Rochester, New York, and he was getting ready to do it in Russia and Germany. He had cut a deal with a Russian prison to take the people who died in the prison, take the possession of the body, take it to Germany, and then clear the body out there. He had also cut a deal with a Jewish old age home on the west side of Manhattan to do the exact same thing. He had done thousands of this stuff, thousands of it, and he didn't care whether or not the body died of. First of all, he didn't care about permission. He forged the permission slip and forged the death certificate. Why? Because if someone died of HIV, let's say, well, that death certificate was no good to him because the processing companies wouldn't take it. So he would forge a death certificate and he'd say, automobile accident. If he had hepatitis, another communicable disease, that became something else. He was taking bone and tissue out of bodies that were not part of what the law said he could take, communicable diseases, and bone from people who are 90, 95. Could you imagine having a bone transplanted into you from a guy who's like, or a woman who's 90 years old? How many people know who Alistair Cook is? He used to be he used to be the master of ceremonies for Masterpiece Theatre. British actor, British personality. So his daughter and Alistair lived in Manhattan. His daughter and Alistair was on the list of people that we found, bodies we found that he had ravaged. And we went over to his daughter and knocked on the door, talked to her, told her what was going on. And she said, you know, I had my father cremated, but when I was going to spread the ashes, I realized that these were like talcum powder. They weren't like little pieces of bone or anything. Now I understand why. They had taken all of the bone and tissue out of him. He was in like 93 or 94 years old. So Mastro Marino, we had Mastro Marino. We had him dead to rights. Excuse the pun. And he wound up taking a plea. He was indicted for we charged him with the state RICO statute. It was a corrupt organization and carried life sentence. So he's in court. The judge sentences him to 18 to 54 years. Basically, it was a life sentence because he was going to die in jail. Families were in the courtroom. They all made victim impact statements. They made all kinds of statements. And about 2 or 3 years later, CBS News was doing a 6-part series called Brooklyn DA. And one of the cases that they wanted to do was Mastro Marino and others. And I was involved in a lot of the cases that they were doing. So I got to know the producers. So one day I'm in the office and the producer who I knew, she comes in, she sits down, she says, I gotta tell you something. I said, what's up? This thing didn't go well, this filming and stuff. She says, no. We just got word that Mastro Marino, who's in prison, died. Guess what he died from? Bone cancer.
Wow.
That is karma. That is what goes around comes around. It was the last piece. A year later, I have to go to film a TV show. It was about Mastro Marino, but it was more about his wife. His wife was a lovely woman, and the show was something about. The guy I married, I had no idea who the guy was that I married, that kind of thing, for one of these Lifetime or something. So I walk into the studio and I'm sitting, and there's a woman sitting there. And she says to me, you're Mike Vecchione, right? I said, yeah, and I'm thinking, who the hell could this be? So she says, I'm Barbara Mastro Marino. Oh, shit, the wife. I used to see her in the courtroom all the time. I said, that's nice. Now I got to sit here with this woman whose husband I put in jail. She goes, I want to thank you. I said, really? She says, what you did saved our family. I had no idea what my husband was doing. And when I found out, I was sick over it. I said, but you really saved us. And so I want to thank you. I was shocked. I'll never forget driving home back to my apartment that I thought about. I said, you know, I guess this is why I do this, you know, in terms of doing this stuff. Help people out, thinking about Mr. Watkins. Now this lady who I never expected to get a thank you from, and other cases, and they said, wow, this is it. And the one thing I thought of was my dad. My dad used to say to me all the time when I became a prosecutor. He said, always do the right thing. If you do the right thing, you never have to worry about anything. And I think I did that. So that's it. That's Crooked Brooklyn. Thank you very much for listening.